The Children's Book of Christmas Stories by various artists. Story number 1, Christmas at Fezziwig's Warehouse by Charles Dickens. "Yo ho, my boy," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick." "Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up," cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands, "before a man can say Jack Robinson." "Hilly ho!" cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. "Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here." "Hilly ho, Dick." "Cheer up, Ebenezer." "Clear away." There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life for evermore. The floor was swept and watered. The lamps were trimmed. Fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see on a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk, and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Misses Fezziwig, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 followers, whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning up in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again. As soon as they got there, all top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, the fiddler struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple, too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 and 20 pairs of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if they had been thrice as many, 4 times as many, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would become of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and came upon his feet again with a stagger. When the clock struck 11, the domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually, as he or she went out, wished them or her a Merry Christmas. End of Christmas at Fezziwig's Warehouse by Charles Dickens. Story number 2 of the Children's Book of Christmas Stories, The Fir Tree by Hans Christian Andersen. Out in the wood stood a nice little fir tree. The place he had was a very good one. The sun shone on him. As to fresh air, there was enough of that, and round him grew many large-sized comrades, pines as well as firs. But the little fir wanted so very much to be a grown-up tree. He did not think of the warm sun and of the fresh air. He did not care for the little cottage children that ran about and prattled when they were in the woods looking for wild strawberries. The children often came with a whole pitcher full of berries, or a long row of them threaded on a straw, and sat down near the young tree and said, "Oh, how pretty he is! What a nice little fir!" But this was what the tree could not bear to hear. At the end of a year he had shot up a good deal, and after another year he was another long bit taller. For with fir trees one can always tell by the shoots how many years old they are. "Oh, were but I such a high tree as the others are," sighed he, "then I should be able to spread out my branches, and with the tops to look into the wide world. Then would the birds build nests among my branches, and when there was a breeze I could bend with as much stateliness as the others." Neither the sunbeams, nor the birds, nor the red clouds which morning and evening sailed above them, gave the little tree any pleasure. In winter, when the snow lay glittering on the ground, a hare would often come leaping along and jump right over the little tree. Oh, that made him so angry! But 2 winters were past, and in the third the tree was so large that the hare was obliged to go round it. To grow and grow, to get older and be tall, thought the tree. That, after all, is the most delightful thing in the world. In autumn the woodcutters always came and felled some of the largest trees. This happened every year, and the young fir tree, that had now grown to a very comely size, trembled at the sight, for the magnificent great trees fell to the earth with noise and cracking. The branches were lopped off, and the tree looked long and bare. They were hardly to be recognized, and then they were laid in carts, and the horses dragged them out of the woods. Where did they go to? What became of them? In spring, when the swallows and the storks came, the tree asked them, "Don't you know where they have been taken? Have you not met them anywhere?" The swallows did not know anything about it, but the stork looked musing, nodded his head, and said, "Yes, I think I know. I met many ships as I was flying hither from Egypt. On the ships were magnificent masts, and I venture to assert that it was they that smelt so of fir. I may congratulate you, for they lifted themselves on high most majestically. Oh, were I but old enough to fly across the sea! But how does the sea look in reality? What is it like?" "That would take a long time to explain," said the stork, and with these words off he went. "Rejoice in thy growth," said the sunbeams. "Rejoice in thy vigorous growth, and in the fresh life that moveth within thee." And the wind kissed the tree, and the dew wept tears over him. But the fir understood it not. When Christmas came, quite young trees were cut down, trees which often were not even as large or of the same age as the fir tree, who could never rest, but always wanted to be off. These young trees, and they were always the finest looking, retained their branches. They were laid on carts, and the horses drew them out of the woods. "Where are they going to?" asked the fir. "They are not taller than I. There was one indeed that was considerably shorter. And why do they retain all their branches? Whither are they taken?" We know," chirped the sparrows. "We have peeped in at the windows in the town below. We know whither they are taken. The greatest splendor and the greatest magnificence one can imagine await them. We peeped through the windows and saw them planted in the middle of the warm room and ornamented with the most splendid things, with gilded apples, with gingerbread, with toys, and many hundred lights." "And then?" asked the fir tree, trembling in every bough. "And then? What happens then?" "We did not see anything more. It was incomparably beautiful." "I would fain know if I am destined for so glorious a career," cried the tree, rejoicing. "That is still better than to cross the sea. What a longing do I suffer! Were Christmas but come! I am now tall, and my branches spread like the others that were carried off last year. Oh, were I but already on the cart! Were I in the warm room with all the splendor and magnificence! Yes, then something better, something still grander, will surely follow, or wherefore should they thus ornament me? Something better, something still grander, must follow. But what? Oh, how I long, how I suffer! I do not know myself what is the matter with me." "Rejoice in our presence," said the air and the sunlight. "Rejoice in thy own fresh youth." But the tree did not rejoice at all. He grew and was green both winter and summer. People, they saw him, said, "What a fine tree!" And toward Christmas he was one of the first that was cut down. The axe struck deep into the very pith. The tree fell to the earth with a sigh. He felt a pang. It was like a swoon. He could not think of happiness, for he was sorrowful at being separated from his home, from the place where he had sprung up. He knew well that he should never see his dear old comrades, the little bushes and flowers around him any more, perhaps not even the birds. The departure was not at all agreeable. The tree only came to himself when he was unloaded in a courtyard with the other trees, and heard a man say, "That one is splendid. We don't want the others." Then two servants came in rich livery and carried the fir tree into a large and splendid drawing room. Portraits were hanging on the walls, and near the white porcelain stove stood two large Chinese vases with lions on the covers. There, too, were large easy chairs, silken sofas, large tables full of picture books and full of toys worth hundreds and hundreds of crowns. At least the children said so. And the fir tree was stuck upright in a cask that was filled with sand. But no one could see that it was a cask, for green cloth was hung all around it, and it stood on a large gaily coloured carpet. Oh, how the tree quivered! What was to happen? The servants as well as the young ladies decorated it. On one branch there hung little nets cut out of coloured paper, and each net was filled with sugar plums. And among the other boughs gilded apples and walnuts were suspended, looking as though they had grown there. And little blue and white tapers were placed among the leaves. Dolls that looked for all the world like men, the tree had never beheld such before, were seen among the foliage, and at the very top a large star of gold tinsel was fixed. It was really splendid, beyond description splendid. "This evening," said they all, "how it will shine this evening!" Oh, thought the tree, if the evening were but come, if the tapers were but lighted, and then I wonder what will happen. Perhaps the other trees from the forest will come to look at me. Perhaps the sparrows will beat against the window panes. I wonder if I shall take root here in winter and summer, stand covered with ornaments. He knew very much about the matter, but he was so impatient for sheer longing he got a pain in his back. And this with trees is the same thing as a headache with us. The candles were now lighted. What brightness, what splendor! The tree trembled so in every bough that one of the tapers set fire to the foliage. It blazed up splendidly. "Help! Help!" cried the young ladies, and they quickly put out the fire. Now the tree did not even dare tremble. What a state he was in! He was so uneasy lest he should lose something of his splendor that he was quite bewildered amidst the glare and brightness, when suddenly both folding doors opened, and a troop of children rushed in as if they would upset the tree. The older persons followed quietly. The little ones stood quite still, but it was only for a moment. Then they shouted so that the whole place re-echoed with their rejoicing. They danced round the tree, and one present after the other was pulled off. "What are they about?" thought the tree. "What is to happen now?" And the lights burned down to the very branches, and as they burned down they were put out, one after the other. And then the children had permission to plunder the tree, so they fell upon it with such violence that all its branches cracked. If it had not been fixed firmly in the cask, it would certainly have tumbled down. The children danced about with their beautiful playthings. No one looked at the tree except the old nurse, who peeped between the branches, but it was only to see if there was a fig or an apple left that had been forgotten. A story!" cried the children, drawing a little fat man toward the tree. He seated himself under it and said, "Now we are in the shade, and the tree can listen too, but I shall tell only one story. Now which will you have? That about Ivedy Avedy, or about Klumpy Dumpy, who tumbled downstairs and yet after all came to the throne and married the princess?" "Ivedy Avedy!" cried some. "Klumpy Dumpy!" cried the others. There was such a bawling and screaming, the fir tree alone was silent, and he thought to himself, "Am I not to bawl with the rest? Am I to do nothing whatever?" For he was one of the company, and had done what he had to do. And the man told about Klumpy Dumpy, that tumbled down, who notwithstanding came to the throne, and at last married the princess. And the children clapped their hands and cried out, "Oh, go on! Do go on!" They wanted to hear about Ivedy Avedy too, but the little man only told them about Klumpy Dumpy. The fir tree stood quite still and absorbed in thought. The birds in the woods had never related the like of this. Klumpy Dumpy fell downstairs, and yet he married the princess. Yes, yes, that's the way of the world, thought the fir tree, and believed it all, because the man who told the story was so good-looking. Well, well, who knows? Perhaps I may fall downstairs too, and get a princess as wife. And he looked forward with joy to the morrow, when he hoped to be decked out again with lights, playthings, fruits, and tinsel. I won't tremble tomorrow, thought the fir tree. I will enjoy to the full all my splendor. Tomorrow I shall hear again the story of Klumpy Dumpy, and perhaps that of Ivedy Avedy too. And the whole night the tree stood still and in deep thought. In the morning the servant and the housemaid came in. Now then the splendor will begin again, thought the fir. But they dragged him out of the room and up the stairs into the loft. And here in a dark corner, where no daylight could enter, they left him. "What's the meaning of this?" thought the tree. "What am I to do here? What shall I hear now, I wonder?" And he leaned against the wall, lost in reverie. Time enough had he, too, for his reflections, for day and nights passed on, and nobody came up. And when at last somebody did come, it was only to put some great trunks in a corner out of the way. There stood the tree quite hidden. It seemed as if he had been entirely forgotten. "'Tis now winter out of doors," thought the tree. "The earth is hard and covered with snow. Men cannot plant me now, and therefore I have been put up here under shelter till the springtime comes. How thoughtful that is! How kind man is, after all! If it only were not so dark here and so terribly lonely! Not even a hare! And out in the woods it was so pleasant when the snow was on the ground and the hare leaped by, yes, even when he jumped over me. But I did not like it then. It is really terribly lonely here." "Squeak, squeak," said a little mouse at the same moment, peeping out of his hole, and then another little one came. They sniffed about the fir tree, rustled among the branches. "It is dreadfully cold," said the mouse, "but for that it would be delightful here, old fir, wouldn't it?" "I am by no means old," said the fir tree. "There's many a one considerably older than I am." "Where do you come from?" asked the mice. "And what can you do?" They were so extremely curious. "Tell us about the most beautiful spot on the earth. Have you never been there? Were you never in the larder where cheeses lie on the shelves and hams hang from above, where one dances about on tallow candles, that place where one enters lean and comes out again fat and portly?" "I know no such place," said the tree, "but I know the woods, where the sun shines, where the little birds sing." And then he told all about his youth, and the little mice had never heard the like before, and they listened and said, "Well, to be sure! How much you have seen! How happy you must have been!" "I?" said the fir tree, thinking over what he had himself related. "Yes, in reality those were happy times." And then he told about Christmas Eve, when he was decked out with cakes and candles. "Oh," said the little mice, "how fortunate you have been, old fir tree!" "I am by no means old," said he. "I came from the woods this winter. I am in my prime, and am only rather short for my age." "What delightful stories you know," said the mice, and the next night they came with 4 other little mice, who were to hear what the tree recounted. And the more he related, the more plainly he remembered all himself, and it appeared as if those times had really been happy times. But they may still come, they may still come. Klumpy Dumpy fell downstairs, and yet he got a princess, and he thought at the moment of a nice little birch tree growing out in the woods. To the fir, that would be a real charming princess. "Who is Klumpy Dumpy?" asked the mice. So then the fir tree told the whole fairy tale, for he could remember every single word of it, and the little mice jumped for joy up to the very top of the tree. Next night 2 more mice came, and on Sunday 2 rats even. But they said the stories were not interesting, which vexed the little mice, and they too now began to think them not so very amusing either. "Do you know only one story?" asked the rats. "Only that one," answered the tree. "I heard it on my happiest evening, but I did not then know how happy I was." "It is a very stupid story. Don't you know one about bacon and tallow candles? Can't you tell any larder stories?" "No," said the tree. "Then good bye," said the rats, and they went home. At last the little mice stayed away also, and the tree sighed. "After all, it was very pleasant when the sleek little mice sat around me and listened to what I told them. Now that too is over, but I will take good care to enjoy myself when I am brought out again." But when was that to be? Why, one morning there came a quantity of people and set to work in the loft. The trunks were moved, the tree was pulled out and thrown, rather hard it is true, down on the floor. But a man drew him towards the stairs where the daylight shone. "Now a merry life will begin again," thought the tree. He felt the fresh air, the first sunbeam, and now he was out in the courtyard. All passed so quickly, there was so much going on around him, that the tree quite forgot to look to himself. The court adjoined a garden, and all was in flower. The roses hung so fresh and odorous over the balustrade, the lindens were in blossom. The swallows flew by and said, "Queer vit, my husband is come." But it was not the fir tree that they meant. "Now then, I shall really enjoy life," said he exultantly, and spread out his branches. But alas, they were all withered and yellow. It was in a corner that he lay, among weeds and nettles. The golden star of tinsel was still on the top of the tree, and glittered in the sunshine. In the courtyard some of the merry children were playing, who had danced at Christmas round the fir tree, and were so glad at the sight of him. One of the youngest ran and tore off the golden star. "Only look what is still on the ugly old Christmas tree," said he, trampling on the branches so that they all cracked beneath his feet. And the tree beheld all the beauty of the flowers and the freshness in the garden. He beheld himself, and wished he had remained in his dark corner in the loft. He thought of his first youth in the woods of the merry Christmas Eve, and of the little mice who had listened with so much pleasure to the story of Klumpy Dumpy. "'Tis over, 'tis past," said the poor tree. "Had I but rejoiced when I had reason to do so! But now 'tis past, 'tis past." And the gardener's boy chopped the tree into small pieces. There was a whole heap lying there. The wood flamed up splendidly under the large brewing copper, and it sighed so deeply. Each sigh was like a shot. The boys played about in the court, and the youngest wore the gold star on his breast, which the tree had had on the happiest evening of his life. However, that was over now. The tree was gone, the story at an end. All was over. Every tale must end at last. End of The Fir Tree by Hans Christian Andersen. Story number 3 of the Children's Book of Christmas Stories. The Christmas Masquerade by Mary E. Wilkens Freeman. On Christmas Eve, the mayor's stately mansion presented a beautiful appearance. There were rows of different colored wax candles burning in every window, and beyond them one could see the chandeliers of gold and crystal blazing with light. The fiddlers were squeaking merrily, and lovely little forms flew past the windows in time to the music. There were gorgeous carpets laid from the door to the street, and carriages were constantly arriving and fresh guests tripping over them. They were all children. The mayor was giving a Christmas masquerade tonight to all the children in the city, the poor as well as the rich. The preparation for this ball had been making an immense sensation for the last 3 months. Placards had been up in the most conspicuous points in the city, and all the daily newspapers had at least a column devoted to it, headed with "The Mayor's Christmas Masquerade" in very large letters. The mayor had promised to defray the expenses of all the poor children whose parents were unable to do so, and the bills for their costumes were directed to be sent in to him. Of course, there was great excitement among the regular costumers of the city, and they all resolved to vie with one another in being the most popular and the best patronized on the gala occasion. But the placards and the notices had not been out a week before a new costumer appeared who cast all the others into the shade directly. He set up his shop on the corner of one of the principal streets, and hung up his beautiful costumes in the windows. He was a little fellow, not much bigger than a boy of 10. His cheeks were as red as roses, and he had on a long curling wig as white as snow. He wore a suit of crimson velvet knee breeches and a little swallow-tailed coat with beautiful golden buttons. Deep lace ruffles fell over his slender white hands, and he wore elegant knee buckles of glittering stones. He sat on a high stool behind his counter and served his customers himself. He kept no clerk. It did not take the children long to discover what beautiful things he had, and how superior he was to the other costumers, and they began to flock to his shop immediately. From the mayor's daughter to the poor rag pickers, the children were to select their own costumes. The mayor had stipulated that it was to be a children's ball in every sense of the word. So they decided to be fairies and shepherdesses and princesses according to their own fancies, and this new costumer had charming costumes to suit them. It was notable that, for the most part, the children of the rich, who had always had everything they desired, would choose the parts of goose girls and peasants and such like, and the poor children jumped eagerly at the chance of being princesses or fairies for a few hours in their miserable lives. When Christmas Eve came and the children flocked into the mayor's mansion, whether it was owing to the costumer's art or their own adaptation to the characters they had chosen, it was wonderful how lifelike their representations were. Those little fairies in their short skirts of silken gauze, in which golden sparkles appeared as they moved with their little funny gossamer wings, like butterflies, looked like real fairies. It did not seem possible when they floated around to the music, half supported on the tips of their dainty toes, half by their filmy purple wings, their delicate bodies swaying in time, that they could be anything but fairies. It seemed absurd to imagine that they were Johnny Mullins, the washerwoman's son, and Polly Flinders, the charwoman's little girl, and so on. The mayor's daughter, who had chosen the character of a goose girl, looked so like a true one that one could hardly dream she ever was anything else. She was ordinarily a slender, dainty little lady, rather tall for her age. Now she looked very short and stubbed and brown, just as if she had been accustomed to tend geese in all sorts of weather. It was so with all the others, the Red Riding Hoods, the princesses, the Bo Peeps, and with every one of the characters who came to the mayor's ball. Red Riding Hood looked around with big frightened eyes, all ready to spy the wolf, and carried her little pat of butter and a pot of honey gingerly in her basket. Bo Peep's eyes looked red with weeping for the loss of her sheep, and the princesses swept about so grandly in their splendid brocaded trains, and held their crowned heads so high that people half believed them to be true princesses. But there never was anything like the fun at the mayor's Christmas ball. The fiddlers fiddled and fiddled, and the children danced and danced on the beautiful wax floors. The mayor, with his family and a few grand guests, sat on a dais covered with blue velvet at one end of the dancing hall and watched the sport. They were all delighted. The mayor's eldest daughter sat in front and clapped her little soft white hands. She was a tall, beautiful young maiden, and wore a white dress and a little cap woven of blue violets on her yellow hair. Her name was Violetta. The supper was served at midnight, and such a supper! The mountains of pink and white ices, and the cakes with sugar castles and flower gardens on the tops of them, and the charming shapes of gold and ruby-coloured jellies. There were wonderful bonbons, which even the mayor's daughter did not have every day, and all sorts of fruits, fresh and candied. They had cowslip wine in green glasses, and elderberry wine in red, and they drank each other's health. The glasses held a thimbleful each. The mayor's wife thought that was all the wine they ought to have. Under each child's plate there was a pretty present, and every one had a basket of bonbons and cake to carry home. At 4 o'clock the fiddlers put up their fiddles, and the children went home, fairies and shepherdesses and pages and princesses, all jabbering gleefully about the splendid time they had had. But in a short time what consternation there was throughout the city! When the proud and fond parents attempted to unbutton their children's dresses in order to prepare them for bed, not a single costume would come off. The buttons buttoned again as fast as they were unbuttoned. Even if they pulled out a pin, in it would slip again in a twinkling. and when a string was untied, it tied itself up again in a bow knot. The parents were dreadfully frightened, but the children were so tired out they finally let them go to bed in their fancy costumes and thought perhaps they would come off better in the morning. So Red Riding Hood went to bed in her little red cloak, holding fast to her basket full of dainties for her grandmother, and Bo Peep slept with her crook in her hand. The children all went to bed readily enough. They were so very tired, even though they had to go in this strange array. All but the fairies. They danced and pirouetted and would not be still. "We want to swing on the blades of grass," they kept saying, "and play hide and seek in the lily cups, and take a nap between the leaves of the roses." The poor charwomen and coal heavers, whose children the fairies were for the most part, stared at them in great distress. They did not know what to do with their radiant, frisky little creatures into which their Johnnies and their Pollys and Betsies were so suddenly transformed. But the fairies went to bed quietly enough when daylight came, and were soon fast asleep. There was no further trouble till 12 o'clock, when all the children woke up. Then a great wave of alarm spread over the city. Not one of the costumes would come off then. The buttons buttoned as fast as they were unbuttoned. The pins quilted themselves in as fast as they were pulled out, and the strings flew round like lightning and twisted themselves into bow knots as fast as they were untied. And that was not the worst of it. Every one of the children seemed to have become, in reality, the character which he or she had assumed. The mayor's daughter declared she was going to tend her geese out in the pasture, and the shepherdesses sprang out of their little beds of down, throwing aside their silken quilts, and cried that they must go out and watch their sheep. The princesses jumped up from their straw pallets and wanted to go to court, and all the rest of them likewise. Poor little Red Riding Hood sobbed and sobbed because she couldn't go and carry her basket to her grandmother, and as she didn't have any grandmother she couldn't go, of course, and her parents were very much doubled. It was all so mysterious and dreadful. The news spread very rapidly over the city, and soon a great crowd gathered around the new costumer's shop, for everyone thought he must be responsible for all this mischief. The shop door was locked, but they soon battered it down with stones. When they rushed in, the costumer was not there. He had disappeared with all his wares. Then they did not know what to do, but it was evident they must do something before long, for the state of affairs was growing worse and worse. The mayor's little daughter braced her back up against a tapestried wall and planted her 2 feet in their thick shoes firmly. "I will go and tend my geese," she kept crying. "I won't eat my breakfast. I won't go out in the park. I won't go to school. I'm going to tend my geese. I will, I will, I will." And the princesses trailed their rich trains over the rough, unpainted floors in their parents' poor little huts, and held their crowned heads very high, and demanded to be taken to court. The princesses were mostly geese girls when they were their proper selves, and their geese were suffering, and their poor parents did not know what they were going to do, and they wrung their hands and wept as they gazed on their gorgeously apparelled children. Finally, the mayor called a meeting of the aldermen, and they all assembled in the city hall. Nearly every one of them had a son or daughter who was a chimney sweep, or a little watch girl, or a shepherdess. They appointed a chairman, and they took a great many votes, and contrary votes, but they did not agree on anything, until every one proposed that they consult the wise woman. Then they all held up their hands and voted too, unanimously. So the whole board of aldermen set out, walking by twos, with the mayor at their head, to consult the wise woman. The aldermen were all very fleshy, and carried gold-headed canes which they swung very high at every step. They held their heads well back, and their chins stiff, and whenever they met a common people they sniffed gently. They were very imposing. The wise woman lived in a little hut on the outskirts of the city. She kept a black cat. Except for her, she was all alone. She was very old, and had brought up a great many children, and she was considered remarkably wise. But when the Alderman reached her hut and found her seated by the fire, holding her black cat, a new difficulty presented itself. She had always been quite deaf, and people had been obliged to scream as loud as they could in order to make her hear. But lately she had grown much deafer, and when the Alderman attempted to lay the case before her, she could not hear a word. In fact, she was so very deaf that she could not distinguish a tone below G sharp. The Aldermen screamed till they were quite red in the faces, but all to no purpose. None of them could get up to G sharp, of course. So the Aldermen all went back, swinging their gold-headed canes, and they had another meeting in the city hall. Then they decided to send the highest soprano singer in the church choir to the wise woman. She could sing up to G sharp just as easy as not. So the high soprano singer set out for the wise woman's in the mayor's coach, and the Aldermen marched behind, swinging their gold-headed canes. The high soprano singer put her head down close to the wise woman's ear, and sung all about the Christmas masquerade and the dreadful dilemma everybody was in G sharp. She even went higher sometimes, and the wise woman heard every word. She nodded 3 times, and every time she nodded, she looked wiser. "Go home and give 'em a spoonful of castor oil all round," she piped up. Then she took a pinch of snuff and wouldn't say any more. So the Aldermen went home, and every one took a district and marched through it, with a servant carrying an immense bowl and spoon, and every child had to take a dose of castor oil. But it didn't do a bit of good. The children cried and struggled when they were forced to take the castor oil. But 2 minutes afterward the chimney sweeps were crying for their brooms, and the princesses screaming because they couldn't go to court, and the mayor's daughter, who had been given a double dose, cried louder and more sturdily, "I want to go and tend my geese. I will go and tend my geese." So the Aldermen took the high soprano singer, and they consulted the wise woman again. She was taking a nap this time, and the singer had to sing up to B flat before she could wake her. Then she was very cross, and the black cat put up his back and spit at the Aldermen. "Give 'em a spanking all round," she snapped out, "and if that don't work, put 'em to bed without their supper." Then the Aldermen marched back to try that, and all the children in the city were spanked, and when that didn't do any good, they were put to bed without any supper. But the next morning when they woke up, they were worse than ever. The mayor and Aldermen were very indignant, and considered that they had been imposed upon and insulted, so they set out for the wise woman again with the high soprano singer. She sang in G sharp how the Aldermen and the mayor considered her an impostor, and did not think she was wise at all, and they wished her to take her black cat and move beyond the limits of the city. She sang it beautifully. It sounded like the very finest Italian opera music. "Dearie me," piped the wise woman when she had finished. "How very grand these gentlemen are!" Her black cat put up his back and spit. "5 times 1 black cat are 5 black cats," said the wise woman. And directly there were 5 black cats spitting and meowing. 5 times 5 black cats are 25 black cats, and then there were 25 of the angry little beasts. 5 times 25 black cats are 125 black cats, added the wise woman with a chuckle. Then the mayor and the Aldermen and the high soprano singer fled precipitately out the door and back to the city. 125 black cats had seemed to fill the wise woman's hut full, and when they all spit and meowed together, it was dreadful. The visitors could not wait for her to multiply black cats any longer. As winter wore on and spring came, the condition of things grew more intolerable. Physicians had been consulted, who advised that the children should be allowed to follow their own bents, for fear of injury to their constitutions. So the rich aldermen's daughters were actually out in the fields herding sheep, and their sons sweeping chimneys or carrying newspapers, and while the poor charwomen's and coal heavers' children spent their time like princesses and fairies. Such a topsy-turvy state of society was shocking. While the mayor's little daughter was tending geese out in the meadow like any common goose girl, her pretty elder sister Violetta felt very sad about it and used often to cast about in her mind for some way of relief. When cherries were ripe in spring, Violetta thought she would ask the cherry man about it. She thought the cherry man quite wise. He was a very pretty young fellow, and he brought cherries to sell in graceful little straw baskets lined with moss. So she stood in the kitchen door one morning and told him all about the great trouble that had come upon the city. He listened in great astonishment. He had never heard of it before. He lived several miles out in the country. How did the costumer look? He asked respectfully. He thought Violetta the most beautiful lady on earth. Then Violetta described the costumer and told him of the unavailing attempts that had been made to find him. There were a great many detectives out constantly at work. "I know where he is," said the cherry man. "He's up in one of my cherry trees. He's been living there ever since cherries were ripe, and he won't come down." Then Violetta ran and told her father in great excitement, and he at once called a meeting of the aldermen, and in a few hours half the city was on the road to the cherry man's. He had a beautiful orchard of cherry trees, all laden with fruit, and sure enough, in one of the largest, way up amongst the topmost branches, sat the costumer in his red velvet and short clothes, and his diamond knee buckles. He looked down between the green boughs. "Good morning, friends," he shouted. The aldermen shook their gold-headed canes at him, and the people danced round the tree in a rage. Then they began to climb, but they soon found that to be impossible. As soon as they touched a hand or foot to a tree, back it flew with a jerk, exactly as if the tree pushed it. They tried a ladder, but the ladder fell back the moment it touched the tree, and lay sprawled upon the ground. Finally they brought axes, and thought they could chop the tree down, costumer and all, but the wood resisted the axes as if it were iron, and only dented them, receiving no impression itself. Meanwhile the costumer sat up in the tree, eating cherries and throwing the stones down. Finally he stood up on a stout branch, and looking down addressed the people. "It's of no use your trying to accomplish anything in this way," said he. "You'd better parley. I'm willing to come to terms with you and make everything right on 2 conditions." The people grew quiet then, and the mayor stepped forward as spokesman. "Name your 2 conditions," said he, rather testily. "You own, tacitly, that you are the cause of all this trouble." "Well," said the costumer, reaching out for a handful of cherries, "this Christmas masquerade of yours was a beautiful idea, but you wouldn't do it every year, and your successors might not do it at all. I want those poor children to have a Christmas every year. My first condition is that every poor child in the city hangs its stockings for gifts in the city hall on every Christmas Eve, and gets it filled, too. I want the resolution filed and put away in the city archives." "We agree to the first condition," cried the people with one voice, without waiting for the mayor and aldermen. "The second condition," said the costumer, "is that this good young cherry man here has the mayor's daughter, Violetta, for his wife. He has been kind to me, letting me live in his cherry tree and eat his cherries, and I want to reward him." "We consent," cried all the people, but the mayor, though he was so generous, was a proud man. "I will not consent to the second condition," he cried angrily. "Very well," replied the costumer, picking some more cherries. "Then your youngest daughter tends geese the rest of her life. That's all." The mayor was in great distress, but the thought of his youngest daughter being a goose girl all her life was too much for him. He gave in at last. "Now go home and take the costumes off your children," said the costumer, "and leave me in peace to eat cherries." Then the people hastened back to the city, and found to their great delight that the costumes would come off. The pins stayed out, the buttons stayed unbuttoned, and the strings stayed untied. The children were dressed in their own proper clothes, and were their own proper selves once more. The shepherdesses and the chimney sweeps came home, and were washed and dressed in silk and velvets, and went to embroidering and playing lawn tennis. And the princesses and the fairies put on their own suitable dresses, and went about their useful employments. There was great rejoicing in every home. Violetta thought she had never been so happy, now that her dear little sister was no longer a goose girl, but her own dainty little lady self. The resolution to provide every poor child in the city with a stocking full of gifts on Christmas was solemnly filed and deposited in the city archives, and was never broken. Violetta was married to the Cherry Man, and all the children came to the wedding and strewed flowers in her path till her feet were quite hidden in them. The costumer had mysteriously disappeared from the cherry tree the night before, but he left at the foot some beautiful wedding presents for the bride, a silver service with a pattern of cherries engraved on it, and a set of china with cherries on it in hand painting, and a white satin robe embroidered with cherries down the front. End of The Christmas Masquerade by Mary E. Wilkens Freeman. Story number 4 of the Children's Book of Christmas Stories, The Shepherds and the Angels, adapted from the Bible. And there were shepherds in the same country, abiding in the field, and keeping watch by night over their flock. And an angel of the Lord stood by them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them. And they were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, Be not afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all the people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Saviour, which is Christ the Lord. And this is the sign unto you: ye shall find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, and lying in a manger. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly hosts, praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. And it came to pass, when the angels went away from them into heaven, the shepherds said one to another, Let us now go even unto Bethlehem, and see this thing that is come to pass, which the Lord hath made known unto us. And they came with haste, and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in the manger. And when they saw it, they made known concerning the saying which was spoken to them about this child. And all that heard it wondered at the things which were spoken unto them by the shepherds. But Mary kept all these sayings, pondering them in her heart. And the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things that they had heard and seen, even as it was spoken unto them. And when 8 days were fulfilled, his name was called Jesus. End of The Shepherds and the Angels, adapted from the Bible. Story number 5 of the Children's Book of Christmas Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elisa McCaslin, May 2012. The Children's Book of Christmas Stories by various artists. The Telltale Tile by Olive Thorn Miller. It begins with a bit of gossip of a neighbor who had come in to see Miss Bennet, and was telling her about a family who had lately moved into the place and were in serious trouble. And they do say she'll have to go to the poorhouse, she ended. To the poorhouse? How dreadful! And the children, too? And Miss Bennet shuddered. Yes, unless somebody'll adopt them, and that's not very likely. Well, I must go, the visitor went on, rising. I wish I could do something for her, but with my house full of children, I've got use for every penny I can rake and scrape. I'm sure I have with only myself, said Miss Bennet, as she closed the door. I'm sure I have, she repeated to herself, as she resumed her knitting. It's as much as I can do to make ends meet, scrimping as I do, not to speak of laying up a cent for sickness and old age. But the poorhouse, she said again. I wish I could help her. And the needles flew in and out, faster than ever, as she turned this over in her mind. I might give up something, she said at last, though I don't know what, unless, she said slowly, thinking of her one luxury, unless I give up my tea, and it don't seem as if I could do that. Some time the thought worked in her mind, and finally she resolved to make the sacrifice of her only indulgence for 6 months, and send the money to her suffering neighbour, Mrs. Stanley, though she had never seen her, and she had only heard she was in want. How much of a sacrifice that was, you can hardly guess, you, Christie, who have so many luxuries. That evening Mrs. Stanley was surprised by a small gift of money from a friend, as was said on the envelope containing it. "Who sent it?" she asked from the bed where she was lying. "Miss Bennet told me not to tell," said the boy, unconscious that he had already told. The next day Miss Bennet sat at the window knitting as usual, for her constant contribution to the poor fund of the church was a certain number of stockings and mittens, when she saw a young girl coming up to the door of the cottage. "Who can that be?" she said to herself. "I never saw her before. Come in," she called, in answer to a knock. The girl entered and walked up to Miss Bennet. "Are you Miss Bennet?" she asked. "Yes," said Miss Bennet with an amused smile. "Well, I'm Hetty Stanley." Miss Bennet started, and her colour grew a little brighter. "I'm glad to see you, Hetty," she said. "Won't you sit down?" "Yes, if you please," said Hetty, taking a chair near her. "I came to tell you how much we love you for—" "Oh, don't say any more," interrupted Miss Bennet. "Never mind that. Tell me about your mother and your baby brother." This was an interesting subject, and they talked earnestly about it. The time passed so quickly that before she knew it she had been in the house an hour. When she went away Miss Bennet asked her to come again, a thing she had never been known to do before, for she was not fond of young people in general. But then, "Hetty's different," she said to herself, when wondering at her own interest. "Did you think kind, Miss Bennet?" was her mother's question, as Hetty opened the door. Hetty stopped as if struck. "Why, no, I don't think I did." "And stayed so long, too? Whatever did you do? I've heard she isn't fond of people generally." "We talked, and I think she's ever so nice. She asked me to come again. May I?" "Of course you may, if she cares to have you. I should be glad to do something to please her." That visit of Hetty's was the first of a long series. Almost every day she found her way to the lonely cottage, where a visitor rarely came, and a strange intimacy grew up between the old and the young. Hetty learned of her friend to knit, and many an hour they spent knitting while Miss Bennet ransacked her memory for stories to tell. And then one day she brought down from a big chest in the garret 2 of the books she used to have when she was young, and let Hetty look at them. One was Thaddeus of Warsaw, and the other Scottish Chiefs. Poor Hetty had not the dozens of books you have, and these were treasures indeed. She read them to herself, and she read them aloud to Miss Bennet, who, much to her own surprise, found her interest almost as eager as Hetty's. All this time Christmas was drawing near, and strange, unusual feelings began to stir in Miss Bennet's heart, though generally she did not think much about that happy time. She wanted to make Hetty a happy day. Money she had none, so she went into the garret, where her youthful treasures had long been hidden. From the chest from which she had taken the books, she now took a small box of light-coloured wood, with a transferred engraving on the cover. With a sigh, for the sight of it brought up old memories, Miss Bennet lifted the cover by its loop of ribbon, took out a package of old letters, and went downstairs with the box, taking also a few bits of bright silk from a bundle in the chest. "I can fit it up for a work-box," she said, "and I'm sure Hetty will like it." For many days after this Miss Bennet had her secret work, which she carefully hid when she saw Hetty coming. Slowly, in this way, she made a pretty needle-book, a tiny pincushion, and an emery bag like a big strawberry. Then, from her own scanty stock, she added needles, pins, thread, and her only pair of small scissors, scoured to the last extreme of brightness. One thing only she had to buy, a thimble, and that she bought for a penny, of brass so bright it was quite as handsome as gold. Very pretty the little box looked when full. In the bottom lay a quilted lining, which had always been there, and upon this the fittings she had made. Besides this, Miss Bennet knit a pair of mittens for each of Hetty's brothers and sisters. The happiest girl in town on Christmas morning was Hetty Stanley. To begin with, she had the delight of giving the mittens to the children, and when she ran over to tell Miss Bennet how pleased they were, she was surprised by the present of the odd little work-box and its pretty contents. Christmas was over all too soon, and New Year's, and it was about the middle of January that the time came which, all her life, Miss Bennet had dreaded, the time when she should be helpless. She had not money enough to hire a girl, and so the only thing she could imagine when that day should come was her special horror, the poorhouse. But that good deed of hers had already borne fruit, and was still bearing. When Hetty came over one day and found her dear friend lying on the floor as if dead, she was dreadfully frightened, of course, but she ran after the neighbours and the doctor, and bustled about the house as if she belonged to it. Miss Bennet was not dead. She had a slight stroke of paralysis, and though she was soon better, and would be able to talk, and probably to knit, and possibly to get about the house, she would never be able to live alone, and do everything for herself, as she had done. So the doctor told the neighbours, who came in to help, and so Hetty heard, as she listened eagerly for news. "Of course she can't live here any longer. She'll have to go to a hospital," said one woman. "Or to the poorhouse, more likely," said another. "She'll hate that," said the first speaker. "I've heard her shudder over the poorhouse." "She shall never go there," declared Hetty with blazing eyes. "Hoity-toity! Who's to prevent?" asked the second speaker, turning a look of disdain on Hetty. "I am," was the fearless answer. "I know all Miss Bennet's ways, and I can take care of her, and I will," went on Hetty indignantly, and turning suddenly, she was surprised to find Miss Bennet's eyes fixed on her with an eager, questioning look. "There, she understands. She's better," cried Hetty. "Mayn't I stay and take care of you, dear Miss Bennet?" she asked, running up to the bed. "Yes, you may," interrupted the doctor, seeing the look in his patient's face, "but you mustn't agitate her now. And now, my good women," turning to the others, "I think she can get along with her young friend here, whom I happen to know is a womanly young girl, and will be attentive and careful." They took the hint and went away, and the doctor gave directions to Hetty what to do, telling her she must not leave Miss Bennet. So she was now regularly installed as nurse and housekeeper. Days and weeks rolled by. Miss Bennet was able to be up in her chair, to talk and knit, and to walk about the house, but was not able to be left alone. Indeed, she had a horror of being left alone. She could not bear Hetty out of her sight, and Hetty's mother was very willing to spare her, for she had many mouths to fill. To provide food for two out of what had been scrimping for one was a problem, but Miss Bennet ate very little, and she did not resume her tea, so they managed to get along and not really suffer. One day Hetty sat by the fire with her precious box on her knee, which she was putting to rights for the 20th time. The box was empty, and her sharp young eyes noticed a little dust on the silk lining. "I think I'll take this out and dust it," she said to Miss Bennet, "if you don't mind." "Do as you like with it," answered Miss Bennet. "It is yours." So she carefully lifted the silk, which stuck a little. "Why, here's something under it," she said, "an old paper, and it has writing on." "Bring it to me," said Miss Bennet. "Perhaps it's a letter I have forgotten." Hetty brought it. "Why, it's father's writing," said Miss Bennet, looking closely at the faded paper. "And what can it mean? I never saw it before. It says, 'Look, and ye shall find.' That's Bible text. And what is this under it? 'A word to the wise is sufficient.' I don't understand. He must have put it there himself, for I never took that lining out. I thought it was fastened. What can it mean?" And she pondered over it long, and all day seemed absent-minded. After tea, when they sat before the kitchen fire, as they always did, with only the firelight flickering and dancing on the walls while they knitted, or told stories, or talked, she told Hetty about her father, that they had lived comfortably in this house, which he built, and that everybody supposed that he had plenty of money and would leave enough to take care of his only child, but that when he died suddenly nothing had been found, and nothing ever had been, from that day to this. "Part of the place I let to John Thompson, Hetty, and that rent is all I have to live on. I don't know what makes me think of old times so tonight." "I know," said Hetty. "It's that paper, and I know what it reminds me of," she suddenly shouted in a way very unusual with her. "It's that tile over there," and she jumped up and ran to the side of the fireplace and put her hand on the tile she meant. On each side of the fireplace was a row of tiles. They were Bible subjects, and Miss Bennet had often told Hetty the story of each one, and also the stories she used to make up about them when she was young. The one Hetty had her hand on now bore the picture of a woman standing before a closed door, and below her the words of the yellow bit of paper, "Look, and ye shall find." "I always felt there was something different about that," said Hetty eagerly. "And you know, you told me your father talked to you about what to seek in the world when he was gone away, and other things." "Yes, so he did," said Miss Bennet thoughtfully. "Come to think of it, he said a great deal about it, and in a meaning way. I don't understand it," she said slowly, turning it over in her mind. "I do," cried Hetty enthusiastically. "I believe you are to seek here. I believe it's loose," and she tried to shake it. "It is loose!" she cried excitedly. "Oh, Miss Bennet, may I take it out?" Miss Bennet had turned deadly pale. "Yes," she gasped, hardly knowing what she expected or dared to hope. A sudden push from Hetty's strong fingers, and the tile slipped out at one side and fell to the floor. Behind it was an opening into the brickwork. Hetty thrust in her hand. "There's something in there," she said in an awed tone. "A light," said Miss Bennet hoarsely. There was not a candle in the house, but Hetty seized a brand from the fire and held it up and looked in. "It looks like bags tied up," she cried. "Oh, come here yourself!" The old woman hobbled over and thrust her hand into the hole, bringing out what was once a bag, but which crumpled to pieces in her hands, and with it, oh, wonder, a handful of gold pieces, which fell with a jingle on the hearth and rolled every way. "My father's money! Oh, Hetty!" was all she could say, and she seized a chair to keep from falling, while Hetty was nearly wild and talked like a crazy person. "Oh, goody, goody! Now you can have things to eat, and we can have a candle, and you won't have to go to the poorhouse." "No, indeed, you dear child!" cried Miss Bennet, who had found her voice. "Thanks to you, you blessing! I shall be comfortable now the rest of my days. And you, oh, I shall never forget you. Through you has everything good come to me." "Oh, but you have been so good to me, dear Miss Bennet." "I should never have guessed it, you precious child. If it had not been for your quickness, I should have died and never found it. And if you hadn't given me the box, it might have rusted away in that chest. Thank God for everything, child. Take money out of my purse and go buy a candle. We need not save it for bread now." "Oh, child," she interrupted herself, "do you know, we shall have everything we want tomorrow. Go, go, I want to see how much there is." The candle bought, the gold was taken out and counted, and proved to be more than enough to give Miss Bennet a comfortable income without touching the principal. It was put back, and the tile replaced, as the safest place to keep it till morning, when Miss Bennet intended to put it into a bank. But though they went to bed, there was not a wink of sleep for Miss Bennet, for planning what she would do. There were 1,000 things she wanted to do first: to get clothes for Hetty, to brighten up the old house, to hire a girl to relieve Hetty so that the dear child should go to school, to train her into a noble woman. All her old ambitions and wishes for herself sprang into life for Hetty, for not a thought of her future life was separate from Hetty. In a very short time everything was changed in Miss Bennet's cottage. She had publicly adopted Hetty and announced her as her heir. A girl had been installed in the kitchen, and Hetty, in pretty new clothes, had begun school. Fresh paint inside and out, with many new comforts, made the old house charming and bright. But nothing could change the pleasant and happy relations between the two friends, and a more contented and cheerful household could not be found anywhere. Happiness is a wonderful doctor, and Miss Bennet grew so much better that she could travel, and when Hetty had finished school days they saw a little of the world before they settled down to a quiet, useful life. "Every comfort on earth I owe to you," said Hetty one day when Miss Bennet had proposed some new thing to add to her enjoyment. "Ah, dear Hetty, how much do I owe to you? But for you I should no doubt be at this moment a shivering pauper in that terrible poorhouse, while someone else would be living in this dear old house. And it all comes," she added softly, "of that one unselfish thought, of that one self-denial for others." End of The Telltale Tile by Olive Thorn Miller.